Hi there, I am Lauren Kramer of More Miles Run Coaching, and I'm here again with Michelle Zahn of More Miles Run Coaching. Well, this is the second in our nutrition chat series. We are both certified run coaches as well as certified performance nutrition coaches. Michelle is actually now open for business as the More Miles Performance Nutrition Coach as well. So today we are moving forward in our second chat. In our first discussion, we talked about your recovery and base training phase when you are either coming off of another event or you're in the very early stages of preparing for your next event or kind of in between seasons. We talked about how our nutritional needs change during that time. We maybe need a little bit less carbohydrate than we've been taking during a high intensity race phase, higher nutrient density, higher quality nutrition intake. Today we're moving forward into the next phase, the race specific phase. So, we spend a certain amount of time in recovery and or base training, developing the routines, developing your base fitness for what you have planned next. As we move into your race specific phase, this is the period. It varies a little bit depending on the athlete and depending on the distance that you're training for. But this can be anywhere from maybe as little as 8 weeks if you are training for a shorter distance event, or you're coming in at a higher level of fitness. It can range as long as 20 or more weeks if you are training for a long distance or are coming in at a very basic level of fitness and we have a lot of work to do. So it really does vary per the athlete, but your training changes during this phase. And so your nutritional needs are going to change during this phase as well. So that's what we're going to talk about today. Okay, so Michelle, when we move into a race specific phase, we are generally doing a little bit, beginning to build more volume. Over the course of this phase, we're going to be building a lot more volume. We're also building volume at intensity. So athletes might see more quality sessions in their workouts, which means your speed workouts, your tempo workouts, and you might even see them more frequently, or you might see those workouts becoming longer, higher intensity sessions. So let's talk about in a given week, you have a lot of different types of workouts that are going to be on your schedule. How can we fuel during a standard training week for those different types of runs?
Yeah, so this is going to depend on a couple of different factors, actually a lot of factors. So one of in nutrition schooling, I don't know if you have the same instructor I did, but his biggest phrase was "it depends." And that's so accurate in performance nutrition, just as run coaching. We have to tailor it to different parts of you and your training cycle and your tolerances. So during base training and recovery, there's a very low emphasis on carbohydrates, high emphasis on protein, and that's going to continue. That high emphasis on protein does not go away. That is consistent throughout your training cycles. However, these carbohydrates start to fluctuate, not only on your daily load, but depending on what your workout schedule looks like. So you may have more carbohydrates on a speed work day or on your long run day. So that depends on your overall schedule and what those workouts actually look like. And then on the type of run. So like a lot of our running is done very low intensity. The majority of it, we have a couple of MAF runs a week or some easy runs. And those are mostly done in an aerobic state. So we're not burning a lot of carbohydrates and we don't need to worry about our carbohydrate intake as much on those days. Those runs can even be done fasted, depending on your dietary patterns as a whole. So if you're a lower carbohydrate eater, you might need some fuel before those runs just as they get longer. So a 4-mile easy run may not require anything. If it's under, it's like 40, 50 minutes, you'd be fine. But, when you start getting those runs over 90 minutes, which typically won't happen until a long run, you can pretty much, fly by the seat of your pants with carbohydrates on those and still perform decently. Where it comes into play is speed work, your speed work and your long runs, and especially your long run workouts. Speed work, that also depends on the distance and the intensity. If you're doing 5 miles with 1 minute sprints, you're not going to need as many carbohydrates. You might be able to just eat a nice snack that includes, some whole grains, like a nice bowl of oatmeal a couple hours before, and then top it up with a gel or some juice before you head out the door. And that would be fine. You won't really need it for in-run fueling until it really gets to that between 60 to 90 minutes, depending on the athlete and the intensity. And then as far as long run workouts, I always recommend treating those as your race day practice, even early on, because the more practice you have starting now, between now and race day, the better you're going to be on race day and know exactly what to eat and when. And then your long runs as well. Now, some of those, depending on your intensity, you could technically go without carbohydrates, because if you're in a low zone 2 and you're burning fat, it's possible you can get away without burning a whole lot of glycogen. However, when it's over 90 minutes, you do tip into those stores, because even in zone 2, you're still burning some carbohydrates. It's not 100% fat burn, so you're using up your stores, and you don't want to deplete them, especially if you have other workouts coming down the week. You don't want to enter them depleted.
Exactly.
And then for normal long runs, I always like my lower carb people or my not carb adapted people to practice their fueling. A lot of people are either lean towards more fat adapted, where they can get away with fasted, their body uses fat for fuel more efficiently, or other people have a lot of GI upset with carbohydrate use. And so the only way to overcome that is to practice using your carbohydrates and slowly increasing what you can take during a workout.
Okay, so even if you are someone who feels like you run pretty well without a whole lot of fuel, it's still something that we need to be practicing at a certain point in your training cycle. You made a really good point there, and I really like that you mentioned when we're looking at long runs, even when you are doing a low intensity long run, because in the earlier phases of your race specific training, most of your long runs will be at a lower intensity. So we know that our body can store a certain amount of glycogen, and that is different based on the athlete and based on their muscle density, based on their diet. So at a low intensity, we're maybe not burning through our entire glycogen storage inside our body. But the good point that you made, well, actually 2 good points that you made. The first being that this isn't a race where we are putting all of our energy into one day and then that's it. We get to recover, we get to rest. We are doing a long run, and then you're going to get up and run again the next day, or the day, 2 days after that. We are continuing to train. So using fuel during your run, before, after your run, is helping you to train again, not just for that run itself. The other good point you made well is the routine of practicing for race day. So, let's say, like we mentioned, the different lengths of cycles. Let's say you're doing a 12-week training cycle. That is at max 12 opportunities to practice what your race day routine is going to look like. You're practicing your morning routine. You're figuring out what sits well in your stomach before you run, or figuring out what doesn't sit well in your stomach before you run. If you're not someone who has fueled regularly, we need to figure out what kind of product works best for you. Whether it's whole food or gel, what brand of gel, how frequently do you need to be taking it, or how far apart do we space those? Fueling during your run is generally not something you can just go out and nail on the first try, or the second try, or the third try. Maybe this is a process, and there's going to be mistakes along the way, and it's a process of figuring out, like you said in the beginning, it depends. It's different for every athlete. We have some general guidelines to start from, but we have to practice as we go through to figure out what's best for you under what circumstances. So, one of the things you mentioned is the difference between an easy long run and a long run workout. A long run workout being a long run where you have a prescribed amount of intensity within that long run. Your body might respond differently to different fuels on those days. The type of event you're training for, if you're training for a high intensity event or a low intensity event, there's a lot of factors that go into it. And so the more practice that you can get, the better. So at what point, you may have mentioned this, I'm sorry, at what point do we need to be fueling our long runs? So, if we know during the week, if we're around 60 minutes or so of intensity, maybe you can get away without fueling during the run. On the long runs, what's kind of that tipping point that it's time we need to be experimenting with fueling during the run for every athlete, no matter what?
Yeah. So typically it's that 90-minute mark. The 90-minute,
Okay.
because your muscles can store about 90 minutes of glycogen. That's it. So even though you're low intensity, you don't know how many of those you burned. Like we have, we are not equipped with all the great equipment the elites have to know exactly how many carbohydrates they burn at which intensity. And it varies a lot from person to person. So you may have burned through 10% of those stores, or you might have burned through 70%, and you want to keep it replenished so you don't bonk or burn out and have that god awful feeling at the furthest point from your house. So, so keeping that regular fueling is very important, even on easier long runs. And also it's another opportunity to practice. And even if you don't use the same exact fuel or the exact intervals you're going to use in your race day, you can practice at least, the hydration, the gel, make sure the brand is right, make sure you like the flavor, because those are all important as well.
Okay. One point that you touched on there that I want to come back to is hydration. Is there a point that we do or don't need to be hydrating? Is that different than fueling?
It's different. And so I still consider it fueling because your body needs electrolytes, and that's just a nutrient your body needs. So I consider that fuel, but it's different in that I don't believe in doing your runs dehydrated. That's just a recipe for danger and disaster, especially in the summer months. Going out dehydrated is really, really bad. Your cardiovascular system needs electrolytes to continue to function. So that's like a non-negotiable. I feel like in the summer, anything of any intensity, I carry a water bottle. If it's anything over 3 miles, I carry a water bottle, just to make sure I'm well hydrated. Any speed work, that has electrolytes in there. And another point this is a personal preference that I have that I think a lot of runners should test is I separate my electrolytes from my carbs. I like them very much separated, because when you have a drink or a concoction that has both electrolytes and carbohydrates, it may not be dialed into your needs, your intake, what you need for carbs and electrolytes, and one of them may be thrown out of balance. So I tend to carry an Element or a Noon in my water bottle with just electrolytes, and I know exactly how much is in there. And then a Martin gel that doesn't have electrolytes but has carbs, that I can take, or some other, I use split packages, the peanut butter and jelly on some long runs, which doesn't have electrolytes but has fuel. So that's something I do like to have people test the waters with, is separating the two out when you can.
I think that's a really good point, especially in summer training. When you have those products that contain electrolytes and calories and carbs, it's possible that your stomach and your gut hits a limit on how many carbs and calories you can take in, while you still need more hydration. Yeah. And those kind of products are going to limit how much you can take in. Okay, so even if we're not fueling with calories or macronutrients, we still need to be carrying hydration every time, even on the easy runs, even on the MAF runs that we don't necessarily need calories.
Yeah.
What about, you had mentioned earlier, so we're beginning to dip into fueling on the run and what you need, even maybe right before you run. What about in your daily life? Should we be fueling differently before one of these workouts, or the day before one of these workouts? Should we be fueling differently after a higher intensity, high quality session?
Yeah, for sure. So before, leading up, I would say it's not like a race where you have to have 3 days of carb loading, because we would be in a constant state of carb loading in that sense. But just the night before or the meal before, a few hours within the 12-hour window, I would say increase your carbohydrates, even if slightly. So my favorite go-to is a sweet potato. I put sweet potatoes with everything the night before. And you can put a little brown sugar on it, extra carbs. There's pasta dishes, have pasta for dinner the night before. It doesn't have to be a whole production. I would say load your carbs towards your workout. Not the meal before necessarily, but 2 meals before. So if you're running at night, give yourself a quality lunch. So that way by evening, you've digested the carbohydrates and had time to store them before you go out on your run. Because eating them right before isn't going to do anything. Your body's going to be trying to digest it while you're running, and you're going to feel terrible. So just it's like a baby carb load the night before these workouts, and just make sure you eat quality food before them. And just like a race, I wouldn't go out into a high intensity long run or a high intensity workout with a bunch of fiber in my stomach either. Keep it right before you eat, if you have breakfast, make it a lower fiber, high carbohydrate meal.
Okay. And then, so like maybe on the other days of the week when you don't have an upcoming high intensity session, those are better days that you can be focusing on your higher fiber, higher nutrient dense foods, your vegetables and things like that.
Right. So vegetables and
Okay.
fruits, while they have a lot of carbohydrates, aren't going to be the fast acting ones you want. You want more of the starchy things like potatoes, pastas, breads, stuff like that.
Sure. Okay. I had another question that I wanted to ask and then I forgot what it was. So we'll move along. Oh, I know what it was. We were talking about fueling before a high quality session, before a long run session. And I like the point that you made about you have a go-to with the sweet potato. That's something you know that works for you. That's a great point about practicing. Again, we talked about practicing how you're fueling your long run as a race day practice. Fueling in your meals leading up to a workout is another great way to do that. You know, how often do you get to a race or you get to, especially if you're traveling and you have no idea what to eat because there's a lot of pressure and a lot of stress and you suddenly panic. And then people have stomach issues going into a race they've worked so hard for because they had something they wasn't familiar to them or they hadn't practiced with. So that's a really great point that the meal that you're having before or 2 meals before your session is another great chance to practice your routine for figuring out what works in your stomach when you're in that kind of micro period before your workout, and figuring out what doesn't work also is going to be part of the process
it's
as well.
Just as important.
Well, and so that leads into a good point about taking notes on those kinds of things. Do you recommend, keeping a log or keeping track of what you're having, especially in those key meals, not only throughout the whole week, but before, during?
Yes, I totally do. And whether you do that in your training log or in like a calorie tracking app or just in a notebook, it comes in very handy because sometimes we forget what we had the night before and we're like, oh man, my stomach's really messed up. Like, what did that? So I think it's really key in helping you. And especially if you're new to in-run fueling or you're testing a new strategy, I think those are both really important times to log whatever you can because you can only manage what you measure. So if you don't know what it was and you don't know the symptoms or the performance enhancement you had, you're not going to be able to replicate that later on or avoid it later on. And so that's why when I tell people that are fueling for the first time, they're like first half marathon, their first marathon, they've never done this in-run fueling before, to practice with different types of products. So don't just go with what your friend says or some elite runner has, because that may or may not work for you. There's, of course, they market these things that they make you think you're going to PR if you just eat this goo, and that's not how it works. And I also would just like to say with that, when you're testing your fueling strategy, don't mix different drinks or different gels or products during your run when you're testing, because you're not going to know which one worked or didn't work. If you have upset, you're going to have like 5 different gels and not know which one may have caused an issue, especially if you have GI issues on the run. So while you're testing, figure out how many gels you'll need for your run and get the same number of that specific gel and try that out. And if it works, great. If it doesn't, move on to the next one and test the next set, just because they're all slightly different formulations, and one type of carbohydrate may interact with your stomach and one may not. So, and there's so many kinds now, you can keep going forever and test them and never repeat. So
Right. That's really great advice. I like that. Not mixing different products when they're new to you and you're trying and figuring things out. Not to say that you can't do that later on, but once you need to know what works and what doesn't first. I like that. Okay, so to give a little plug right here, I really like that comment you said too about you can only manage what you measure, or I think that's what you said, manage what you measure. I really love that. So keeping track of your on the run fueling in your training log is really helpful both for you and for your coach, because it's going to help you to keep a diary, keep track of what you're doing, and it's also going to cue your coach into what you're doing or not doing in terms of fueling your run and help to problem solve those kinds of things. But the service that you are offering as Performance Nutrition is taking it really one step above. You are really helping an athlete track their daily nutrition, how they are fueling every single day, how they, for themselves as an individual, need to adjust throughout the week for the workouts that they have, and adjust along with their training on a larger scale. So you are tracking not only your workout fuel, but all day long. And using the app that you're using is called Chronometer, for those who aren't familiar with it, where you really are keeping track of all day what you're putting into your body and across a week and larger time frames. So I think that's a huge valuable resource to really be able to see patterns and identify problem areas and strength areas and really fine tune your nutrition needs to the individual. A lot of what we'll talk about on our nutrition chats is general, to the athlete, but not necessarily to the individual. And that's really a game changer, I think, to have a nutrition coach on your side who can really help you dial into your specific needs based on your training. Yeah. So you can find more information about us as well as the nutrition coaching service on moremilestogo.com, or on social. You can find us at More Miles Run Coaching on any social channel. It's all the same. Before we sign off, is there anything that you wanted to add?
No, this has been great, and I look forward to the next one.
All right. We have a lot we can get into, so we will have several more of these. Okay. Thanks for joining me. Bye, guys.
Bye.